The desert is a starkly beautiful yet severe place to be. This is true both literally and metaphorically when we face arid and dry times in our lives. The wilderness has a prominent place in the Bible. It's the place where most of the foundational pieces of Scripture were written. When God led his people out of Egyptian slavery, he didn't bring them immediately into the land flowing with milk and honey. There was work to be done, a people to be formed, a culture to be created, an identity to be bestowed. And for this work, God chose the wilderness. In the wilderness, God parted the Red Sea for his people to cross over, destroying the armies of their previous masters in the process. In the wilderness, he gave the 10 Commandments. In the heat of the desert, God melted away the identity of slavery and established a new one, God's chosen people. In the wilderness, the Torah was written. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In the merciless and unforgiving terrain of the desert, God provided for his people. When there was literally no other way for them to survive, God supplied what they needed. In the wilderness, God instructed a tabernacle to be created, one in which he would meet with them personally, one that would stay among them wherever they went and at the center of all they did. In the wilderness, the people thrashed about, in one moment longing to return to slavery, in another casting a golden calf and worshiping it. And then there was God, fathering them, allowing them to reap the harvest of their choices, waiting for them to settle into the fact that he was sovereign and he had chosen them. From the desert, the people decided they couldn't conquer the promised land. And for another generation, they wandered. They stayed there a lot longer than they had to. But the day finally came. They crossed the Jordan River and entered their destiny. Everyone wants the promised land. But what we often fail to realize is that it is in the desert that we are being formed. It is the struggle of the wilderness that gives us the appreciation for where God is leading our lives. It is often the struggle forward that allows us to savor the triumph. May we embrace the seasons we spend in the desert. They are forming us into who we are, chosen.
There are a lot of times where our realities don't match our expectations. I think if you've had children, or if you've been around children, as a parent, you think, oh, I'm going to be different from my parents. I'm going to be the best parent in the world, and my kids are going to be the perfect children. But often, our expectations aren't met. In reality, our kids act in a way, maybe in the same way we acted. As I was going throughout this last week, I began to think about this a little bit, and I actually found some slides, some different explanations of some of the things that we deal with as parents, or if you've been around children, if you work with children at all. Our kids can so easily succumb to complaining. In fact, it can be a daily reality. So I just want to share a couple slides, a couple different things that parents have gone to. Here's a child complaining. He says he doesn't want to go, even though we've repeatedly told him we're not going anywhere. Have you ever had a child, something like that? He put himself in timeout for no reason, and so he's grumbling and complaining. He's throwing a fit. This is my favorite. I wouldn't let him get a tattoo. Sometimes it's not a reasonable thing why our children are complaining. Sometimes it's completely unreasonable why they're complaining. I wouldn't let her play with a bag of dog poop. Oh, I broke this cheese in half. This is every child. I didn't want my peanut butter and jelly sandwich torn into or cut into. I wanted it whole, or I wanted it in squares, or this is a constant one. He can't reach the pennies; they're too far away. He's just so close and yet so far away, and so he's throwing a fit. He's grumbling and complaining. We said she couldn't have more bacon. Now this is legitimate. Like this is horrible. This is child abuse. He can't have more bacon. Now, we're able to laugh a little bit at this, right? Even though in the moment, maybe if it was our kid, it wasn't quite as funny. But here's some parents that have found a way to sort of laugh their way through this grumbling and complaining, sometimes that our kids do that absolutely makes no sense. You ask the kids to do something, oh, I can't, my feet hurt. I can't oh, I'm going to die. Oh, I can't. Everything becomes a big deal. Now, it can be funny in kids, like, departed from, like, time, right? Like, you can look back and laugh. Imagine if adults started acting like this, though. Like, take each one of those situations and maybe put in an adult. It's not quite as cute. It's not quite as funny, that grumbling and complaining. But in reality, the truth is that we all grumble and complain at times, I think. Even this last week, there were some things happening, some going on, and I kind of got the attitude of just kind of, just grumbling, complaining. And I came in the morning, I started working on my sermon, and God hit me, and we're like, okay. I'm speaking to myself because I know how easy it is for me to succumb to that same attitude of grumbling and complaining about things that are seemingly so small. Grumbling and complaining about things that I shouldn't be grumbling and complaining about. Maybe in your situation, it's a boss, and the boss made a decision that you don't like, and so you go to your coworkers and, can you believe what that boss did, that decision that he made? Grumbling and complaining to them. Maybe it's a teacher, and the teacher didn't grade something fairly, and you get upset and like, can you believe they graded that way? I had the right answer, and they didn't count it. Maybe it's something with your spouse, and you're like, you go to your friends like, I can't believe what he or she did. And you begin to grumble and complain, and what was maybe a small problem after an hour or so of grumbling and complaining to your friend about it, who probably didn't want to hear about it in the first place. What happens is it begins to grow, and that anger and that frustration and that complaining and that grumbling begin to grow. And what may have been a small thing in the moment becomes much larger. We get more upset the more we grumble and complain. And what may have started small, we begin to take on an attitude of ingratitude. Where we worry and we complain and we gripe and we moan, and it can be so easy to be overcome by these feelings. We all know those people whose lives, it seems to be one constant complaint after another. Do you know those kind of people? Like, they're always miserable about everything. And you see them coming, and you're like, how can I get away from this? How can I get away from this person? They're toxic. They're poisonous. Grumbling and complaining can so easily become a part of our lives. It can take us over. And so in our times of wondering, in our times of maybe not everything going the way that we would want it to go, in our wondering, in our difficulties, when we have the opportunity, are we worrying about the situation and complaining, or are we worshiping? Because we have a choice. Our wondering can either lead to worry and ingratitude or worship. Now, we all know the dangers, so the question becomes, now what? What do I do? If I've recognized this about myself, what do I do? As we've been studying the book of Exodus, studying about this people called Israel who are coming out of slavery, we've seen how God has led and directed them. And what should have started off as an amazing story of God's protection and provision for his people. He's called them out, and he's done miraculous signs for them. And then a little bit of difficulty hits. So let's, if you have your Bibles, turn with me to Exodus chapter 13. How do we overcome these constant complaints? Because Israel is going to enter into a time of wandering in the wilderness. Wandering in the desert that we saw in that video. And what will their attitudes be? Will they trust God? Or will they worry about everything and complain about everything? Exodus chapter 13, starting in verse 17. It says, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So this makes sense on the part of God. Remember, he's beginning to mold this people who've been in slavery for hundreds of years. And God rightly says to himself, listen, if they go this way, if they go the way of the Philistines, they're going to meet immediate opposition. They're going to go to war with these people, and they're not going to trust in me. Like, I have to bring these people around slowly. I have to take the slavery out of them. I have to teach them to trust in me. So I'm not going to take them that way. I'm going to lead them into the desert. I'm going to give them opportunities and over again show my power and do the miraculous in their lives so that over time, by the time they get to the promised land several years later, they will trust in me. And I will conquer the peoples there and provide for them richly and abundantly. So God says, I'm not going to give them immediate, severe trials. I'm going to lead them into the desert. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath. He said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. So God had told them hundreds of years before, listen, I'll come to your aid. I'm going to be with you. Trust me. Trust me. After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them the light, so they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. Imagine for a moment you're the people of Israel. You have a visible sign of God's presence. Cloud, fire. You're seeing something amazing at all points of your day. God is showing you through these things that he is with you. You've seen in the past how he's led you out of slavery. He's done the miraculous. Now you're in the desert. I mean, naturally it should come as second nature to say, like, I don't know what trials I'm going to face, but I mean, there's God. He's with us. I'm going to trust in God for whatever comes our way. But time and time again, we'll see that that's not the option the Israelites chose. In fact, what happens is God leads them around a little bit into the Egyptians. It seems a little chaotic. And I don't know if the Egyptians thought like Israel was coming back or what, but they say they realize like we've lost all of our slave labor, and they send their troops after Israel. So much so that they trap them in a place where on the one side is the Egyptian army, and on the other side is the Red Sea. Between a rock and a hard place. Do they trust that God will once again provide for them? No, this is what we see happening. Flip just the next page over, or I guess depending on how your Bible's laid out, chapter 14, verses 10 to 14. This is what happens. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there was no graves in Egypt that you brought us into the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Like, this is the classic, and we've seen this in our classic, the classic over-complaint. Oh, it would have been better to die there in slavery than to die here in the desert in freedom. Totally taking the situation way out of perspective. It would have been better. Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance that the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You only need to be still." In other words, just pause for a moment. Remember God's faithfulness. Like, stop getting so carried away in your worrying and in your complaining. And that's exactly what we see happening. Imagine millions of people all crying out, all upset. And of course, God does provide a way out. He parts the sea, right? And all the Israelites go through the sea to on dry ground. They get to the other side, and Pharaoh and his army says, "Well, we're going to go after them." And so they follow them foolishly into the sea. And the waves come crashing back down, and the entire Egyptian army dies. They're gone. That entire army is dead. They're complaining, and they're grumbling, and their worrying was for naught. God had protected them. And in chapter 15, we can see that there's this beautiful song that Moses and Miriam sing to God, giving praise to God for what he had done. You see, the proper response of the Israelites when they were faced with difficulty was not grumbling and complaining. It was simply say, "God, you see our problem here. We ask that you provide for us. We ask that you protect us." The proper response when troubles and trials and persecutions happen, in our wondering, when life isn't as great as we perhaps think it should be, the appropriate response is to pray and to worship. And Moses and Miriam lead them in a time of corporate worship together, thanking God for all that he has done for them. And now Israel gets it, right? No, of course not. Of course not. I mean, now in our Bibles, this is the exact next page or maybe the next chapter. We see something else happening. In Exodus 15. Now I'm going to read a little bit of backstory. So I added a little bit more than what's going to be on the screen. Verse 25 and 26 are going to be on the screen. So there comes a period of time where they're wandering in the desert. It says, "Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea." So we went directly from that place of worship to the next place. And they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding any water. Now 3 days is like the upper limit of how long you can go without water. No doubt they had some supplies, but like 3 days is the extent. Now, day 1, without finding water, I'm praying to God. Day 2, things have got a little bit more urgent now. Day 3, I'm definitely doing that. But is that what their response is? No, we'll see it's not. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That's why the place is called Marah. Marah means bitter. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" So again, you see this grumbling and complaining. Option number 1 for them is griping, is complaining, is throwing a fit. Woe is me, woe is us, we're all going to die. And then verse 25, then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. Then the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. He said, if you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to be with you no matter what happens. So God leads them then from a place called Marah, bitterness. It says, and then they came to Elim, where there are 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped near the water. Elim literally means place of blessing. In many ways, it's indicative of the entire Exodus story. God takes them from a place of bitterness to a place of blessing. The whole Exodus story, God's taken them from a place of bitterness in Egypt, in slavery, to a place of blessing in the promised land. The question is, will they trust? See, man can't live on just water alone. They have to have food as well. So it gets to the point where they've gone a certain period of time without food, and they naturally pray to God, please send us food. We need it. Is that what they do? No, of course not. Next chapter, verse 16. The whole Israelite, starting in verse 1, 16:1, the whole Israelite community set out from Elim. So again, they just left this place of blessing and came to the desert of Sin, which is in between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat. We sat around barbecue. Life was grand. And ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. At other points, they look back and like, we had all of the leeks we wanted. We had all of the veggies we wanted. We had all the meat we wanted. Like, life was so perfect then. How quickly they had forgotten the bitterness of their slavery. And yet they succumb once again, instead of asking God to grumbling and complaining. Now, once again, God provides for them. He says, listen, when you wake up in the morning, there'll be this food on the ground. It's called manna. Literally, manna means, what is it? They weren't sure what it was, but they knew it was edible. And every day you were to collect enough for your family for that day. Don't collect any more. Don't leave any until the next day, because why? Tomorrow I'll provide for you again. He's teaching them to trust. Every day, it's a daily trust in God. That he will provide, that he will protect them. So tomorrow I'm going to put out some more food, and then the day before Sabbath, collect enough for 2 days, because I don't want you going out on the Sabbath. I'm not going to provide for you on the Sabbath. So take enough for 2, because any other day, if you collect for 2 days, it'll mold, it'll get nasty, you won't be able to eat it. And naturally, the Israelites listened to God. No. See, they worry, well, I know God has said this, but what if there isn't food tomorrow? And some of them naturally go out and collect enough for 2 days. They're worrying instead of trusting God. And of course, that food that they've collected for the second day naturally molds, it gets nasty, and they have to go out again and get more food. He's teaching them to trust in him, to trust in his provision for them. It takes a long time for a people who've been in slavery, who've maybe grumbled and complained their whole lives about the harshness of slavery, to simply trust in God. God knows this is a part of the problem. He's bringing them around slowly, teaching them, never giving them anything more they can handle, teaching them to trust in him. Now, once again, we see that in chapter 17. Now, this is the kind of the ultimate one here, right? 17. They need water again. Now, naturally, they remembered what had happened a couple of weeks beforehand when they needed water, and naturally, they trusted in God. Nope, it's not what we see happening. Starting in 17, verse 1. It says, the whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin. God just provided for them food there. Set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, where there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. Did they ask God? No, still, their default position is grumbling and complaining, grumbling and complaining, grumbling. Like, Moses is my hero. Moses knows what it's like to be a parent. Taking care of these kids who are constantly grumbling and complaining instead of just simply saying, I need this. Moses replied, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? Why are you questioning the character and the love and the protection and the provision of God? Why are you putting the Lord to the test? You've seen all of these times where God's provided for them. Why are you putting God to the test? Why are you doubting his goodness and his love for you? That's what worry does. It forces us to focus on ourselves and about what we don't have instead of trusting in God. But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, why did you bring us out into Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die like this? And then Moses cried out to the Lord, what am I to do with these people? Like, you could sense like the exasperation, like, God, what am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me. The Lord answered Moses, go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. So Moses did this in the sight of the elders, and he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled, and because they tested the Lord, saying, it is the Lord among us or not. So he named it Massah. Massah means testing. So he's like, this is the place. We're going to rename this place. It's called Massah. This is the place where the Lord tested us. And we're going to name it Meribah, which means quarreling. The place was known as the place where you quarreled against God instead of trusting in God. It's going to be a forever reminder for you of your grumbling and complaining and your lack of faith and your lack of trust in God. Over and over again, what we should naturally see is the Israelites trusting in God, worshiping God, asking God for provision and provision and protection. But we see so often that they don't. As they journey through the wilderness, we see them being attacked by peoples. Sometimes they trust in God, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they need more food, or they're complaining about not having meat, or they're complaining about this, or they're complaining about that. And there's this attitude of ingratitude, this constant grumbling and complaining. So after 2 years of seeing God provide for them in all of these different areas, they get to the promised land. They're just about ready to cross over, and they send out spies. Well, if you read on other books outside Exodus, you see this happening. They send out spies into the promised land, into Canaan, into this place where God was going to provide for them. 10 of the 12 spies that they had sent out come back saying, nope, God can't do it. Nope, too big. Guys there are too big. Like, it's a wonderful place. Place of blessing. They've got leeks and grapes and all those things we love back in Egypt, but I don't know if we can do it. All along, God had wanted them to realize, you're exactly right. You can't do it, but I can. 2 spies trusted in God. 2 years, God had been training them. For 2 years, their default position was grumbling and complaining. And they weren't able to enter into this place of blessing. They weren't able to enter into the promised land. I wonder how many of us this morning, as you look at your life, would say, you know what? As I look at myself, as I look at how I handle problems, I do a lot of grumbling, complaining. Paul was an early follower of Jesus. Paul was writing this letter to this church, and he says, stop grumbling and complaining all the time. Stop it. Trust in God. Trust in what God has for you. Trust that He'll provide for you, that He'll protect you. Don't question the character of this God that we all worship, because He's already provided for us every good thing in our lives, every blessing in our lives. Most of all, He's given us Christ, that we might find forgiveness of sins, that we might have eternal life. He says that's the greatest blessing of all. So as we go out throughout our lives, let me give you several things to take home. Whether you recognize that grumbling, complaining is a big part of your life, or maybe they're just at times you sense that attitude coming on. Let me give you these 2 things. First, I want you to exchange worry with worship. What would it look for you to say, I'm going to worship God? I'm not going to worry about everything. Some of us who live in our minds, we think through every possible scenario that could possibly happen. We worry. I'm like that. I get it. I'm not so detached that I don't get it. I get it. It is so easy to worry and worry and worry. What would it mean if we say, God, here's all of the things in life that I could worry about? And if I were to worry about it, I would be up for hours. My mind would be worrying for hours about it. But what would it look like for simply to say, God, here's everything I'm worried about. I give it to you. And I've seen your faithfulness in the past. And I see that if I continue to worry about this, it's going to lead to grumbling, complaining. What would it look like to simply say, God, I give it to you. I trust in you that you'll take care of it. And to simply sing praises to God instead. What if we exchanged our worry for worship? How would that affect our lives? 2, exchange grumbling with gratitude. To simply be grateful for everything that God has given to us. To recognize the blessings in your life. To recognize all that God has done for you. We're no longer a slave to sin and fear and death. We have new life in Christ. What would it look like to be thankful? It's a question I want us to consider this morning. As Lisa comes up and as the prayer team comes up in just a minute, I want us to just pause and to reflect in our lives. What is our default position? What do we naturally go to? When trials, when temptations, whatever happens, when our expectations aren't met, we have a choice. What is your choice? Have you been leading a lifestyle of grumbling and complaining? Have you been leading a life do you have an attitude of ingratitude? Because in your times of wandering, maybe through a desert, maybe through a dry time, you have a choice. Will you worry or will you worship? As the prayer team comes up, I just want to give you opportunity to say, maybe, I recognize this about my own life and I don't like it, and God, I need your help. As we go to a time of just meditation, as we go to a time of reflection, what is God speaking to you this morning? And maybe you want to say, listen, I need to change my attitude. I need to change what it is that I do. Or maybe it's something completely different that you need prayer for this morning. Maybe you're going through something in your life that's completely separate from the sermon even. And you would say simply, I need prayer. I need that touch from God. And all of the things, like I could worry about my health, I could worry about this thing in my life, but even before I get there, I just simply want to focus on worship and asking God that he'll work in an amazing way. This is what our prayer team's here for, to simply lift you up and to help you focus on God during this time in your life. And I just ask, you spend a couple minutes in prayer, reflect, and if you would like prayer, to come forward.